So we've crossed the A14. We're now in northeast Northamptonshire in the village of Fotheringhay. This was mentioned in the Domesday Book as Fotheringhay, basically an enclosure where fodder is stored. We have that Tudor connection here as well, with Mary Queen of Scots being executed at the castle, but prior to that there is a very strong Plantagenet connection here. This manor was held by the Dukes of York for many years, and Richard III was born here. Not only did they occupy the castle prior to the Tudors, but they also built the church behind me, St Mary and All Saints. This was built by Edward III, and originally it was a church with cloisters and also a college next to it. Now, only really the church remains today. In fact, on the back wall of the church you can see the archway where I think the chapel and the choir was destroyed during dissolution. So the church you see today is really just half the length of the original building. And you can also see just over the wall, the other side of the church, the base for where the college was built as well. All of that obviously was destroyed at the same time. So the whole building was completed in 1430, but prior to that, Edward the Duke of York, who had been killed at Agincourt, was buried here in 1415. But there are other York burials here as well. Richard Plantagenet, the third Duke of York, who was Richard III's father, and also Richard III's younger brother, Edmund the Earl of Rutland, they were both killed in the Battle of Wakefield, which took place in 1460. Now, they were laid to rest in Pontefract, but 16 years later, 1476, Richard III had his father and his brother disinterred, and the bodies brought here to Fotheringhay, where they were buried with sort of pomp and ceremony, and also an elaborate monument was built to house their bodies. As we've said, that was all destroyed under Henry VIII with the Reformation, the dissolution. But his daughter Elizabeth I, when she visited Fotheringhay during her reign, was so shocked by this destruction that she had new monuments made. And we can still see those inside the church today. Now, Richard III, we all know about, perhaps slightly unfairly, through Shakespeare, who painted not a very flattering picture of him. He, of course, was the last of the Plantagenets, and he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field during the Wars of the Roses. I'm sure you all know the story that his body was discovered, I think it's about 10 years ago, 2012, by a team in Leicester. And the remains were beneath a car park. I don't think it was a car park back in the day. I believe he was buried in a friary. I think it was a friary at the time, but these days it's a car park. So they found his remains, and he was disinterred and buried again with full circumstance. And indeed, even today, members of the Richard III Association visit the church here to lay a white rose. Now, there seems to be only one paranormal event attached to the church as far as I can find out, and that was a local chap by the name of John Priest, who came to the church one day and heard the sound of music. But this wasn't organ music like you might expect to hear coming from inside a church. He said it was very loud with drums and trumpets, so something almost medieval. And of course, when he opened the door, the music stopped and the church was deserted. And this apparently had been reported by a couple of other people as well, including a local police officer. So some speculate this is perhaps going back to those earlier burials, those earlier ceremonies when the Plantagenets were laid to rest here. So I've just found something in the church that I wanted to share with you. Being a musician, being an organist, it's this marvellous instrument which is known as a Winfield organ. This one was actually made around the soundboard from an organ that dates back to around the 1530s or 1540s. And it's amazing to me to think that these instruments that are that old, or even parts of them, can still be functional today. It's powered by bellows at the side there, so it's a two-person job. One person has to work the bellows, the other person plays the keyboard. But I should imagine it gives a magnificent sound, and of course with the acoustics in spaces such as this, it's a shame I can't have a go, but we'd best not. So here we are at Fotheringhay Castle. This is where the old gateway would have been, and you can see you've got the moat on each side. Obviously there's nothing remaining today apart from one small fragment of wall, But you get a sense with these Motte and Bailey castles of how difficult this would have been to attack, presuming you could get through the gate and outer defences. And then you've got to negotiate this with, of course, more fortifications at the top. So let's go up to the top of the Motte, see what we can see. So it's a lovely view from up the top here. If we look just across to the right there, we can see the River Nen, one of the two major rivers in the area, along with the Great Ouse that goes out to the Roche. So where I'm standing now would have been the site of the keep, and the Great Hall and other buildings would have been down there below. As I say, very strong site for a fortification with the river next to it as well. And if we look across just in the distance there, I don't know if you can see there's a set of raised earthworks there. Well, this castle was under siege in the 1220s, and that earthwork is all that remains of the siege camp that was built by the besiegers. In fact, I think it changed hands 1 or 2 times during that time. So this was a Norman castle of Motte and Bailey design, built around the year 1100, and it was thought to be built for, or certainly kept by, one of William the Conqueror's most trusted knights. In the 13th century it was confiscated by King John, and it stayed in royal hands until the reign of Edward II. As we've mentioned, this was a favoured residence of the Dukes of York, and Richard III was born in the castle. When the Tudors came to power, the castle fell into disuse, probably because of the York connection, though Henry VIII did later gift it to Catherine of Aragon, and we know that she spent a lot of money refurbishing the place, obviously before she ended up imprisoned at Kimbolton. The place mainly became used as a sort of prison, and of course we know that the most famous person imprisoned here was Mary Queen of Scots. She was brought here in 1586, and again we have to remember the same as with Kimbolton Castle. Back in those days this was quite a remote and wild area, out on the edge of the fens, and as we've already seen, very well fortified. So she was imprisoned here, put on trial here, and then 8th of February 1587 she was executed in the Great Hall, which would have been in this area just in front of us now. Now, Mary had a very interesting life, it's a very interesting history, and I recommend you read up about it if you don't know about it already. She was the only surviving child of James V of Scotland, and he passed away only a few days after she was born. So she actually succeeded to the Scottish throne at the age of 6 days old. At the age of 10, she was betrothed to Henry VIII's only male child, Edward. Henry was very keen to keep Scotland on board, though he went about it in a strange way because he actually started to raid Scotland and invade it, and so Mary, at the age of 5, was taken out of Scotland and to France for her own safety. Now, Edward, of course, died, and Catherine's daughter Mary took over the English throne, who later became known as Bloody Mary for her, let's say, enthusiastic activities against anyone who opposed her, particularly Protestants, because she was a Catholic queen. When Bloody Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth I took the throne, but a lot of people, particularly Catholics, weren't happy with this because they saw Scottish Mary, who was a Stuart, as the rightful heir to the throne. They said that she had seniority of descent through Henry VII. You've got to remember at the time all these royal families were interrelated. In fact, I think Mary was Henry's great niece, so there were family connections there. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail of the rest of the history as we haven't got time here today, but eventually Mary was taken prisoner and held captive. There were various Catholic plots, of course, against Elizabeth, and she could be quite ruthless in rooting those out, particularly through her chief spy, Lord Walsingham. In 1586, Mary was arrested and implicated in something called the Babington Plot, which involved coded letters plotting the assassination of Elizabeth. Some say it was genuine. There are other views that Walsingham had a hand in falsifying the evidence for this. In any event, Mary was taken prisoner and held captive. On the 25th of September 1586, Mary was brought here to Fotheringhay Castle to stand trial. She was tried by a group of high and mighty. We've already met one of them, Sir John Popham. As we know, she was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. And on the 5th of February 1587, she was taken into the Great Hall just below the motte here for the execution. Now, we have a very detailed contemporaneous account of this, which I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I just wanted to pick out some interesting details. I'll put a link up to the full account in the notes below. But we know that she was dressed in black silk, and when the black silk was taken off, underneath she was wearing a bright red bodice. This is significant because red was seen as the colour of martyrs, and of course this was a Protestant Queen Elizabeth putting a Catholic Queen Mary to death. There were about 300 people present, and the scaffold was erected at one end of the hall, and it was said to be 2 foot high and about 12 feet wide. Mary sat while the sentence was read out, then she was led to the block and executed. It actually took 2 attempts. The first one, it is said, hit the back of her neck, and she was heard to mutter, "Sweet Jesus." Oh, wouldn't you? The second stroke took the head off almost all the way, but there was some muscle that had to be sawn through before the head could be removed. Apparently then, the executioner raised Mary's head up, but because she was wearing a wig, the head slipped out and he was just left standing with the wig in his hand. There's also some that say when the head was placed to the side, the lips kept moving for 15 minutes after her death. Now, Elizabeth was very keen that despite this red outfit, Mary wouldn't be seen as a martyr. And of course, what used to happen at the time were people would try and get relics. So they'd try and get the blood of the martyr or some part of the body. So immediately on execution, the body was taken away, all the clothes were removed and burnt, no one was allowed near it, the blood was cleaned up very quickly. Basically, there was no chance of anyone getting a relic from Mary's body. Now, following that event, some say that the castle was cursed, and in fact the whole thing was demolished in the 1630s. Some say that was on the orders of James, Mary's son, but history is not too clear on that. The Scottish thistles that grow around here, even to this day, are known as Queen Mary's Tears. But now the interesting thing is, some of the stone from the castle on one of the mullioned windows was taken to nearby Oundle to help build the Talbot Hotel. Something else that is said to have been taken from the castle to the hotel is the staircase that Mary walked down to her execution. This is said to be the same staircase that is now in the hotel. Now again, it's debatable. History is not quite clear on that, though some claim that it definitely is the same staircase because apparently there's an imprint on the banister at one point, and it's an imprint where someone has grabbed the banister and their ring as pressed into the wood, and the ring is the sign of the crown, which would have been the ring that Mary was wearing. So make of that what you will. The Talbot is quite an old hotel. In fact, this area has been inhabited as far back as the Bronze Age. So again, there's layers and layers of history here. But I think that the Talbot Hotel certainly dates back to the 17th century and possibly before that. So they have the stairs now. As you go up the stairs, there's a big picture of the execution, which is said to move at certain times. And at the top of the stairs, they have the Queen Mary suite. And people have reported various types of paranormal activity in there. Mary's been seen, or again, the idea of figures or temperature drops. So that's by no means the only paranormal activity that's been reported at the Talbot, or the Tabret as it was originally known. It's a very old building. In fact, in 638, local monks established a hospitium there to help feed local travellers. So it's got a very long history, lots of additions to the buildings. It's one of those places that you might expect to be haunted. And if you have a search on YouTube, you'll find lots of paranormal groups who have gone there for investigations. So that's it for today's Innsmouth excursion. I hope you've enjoyed that. As always, if you have any questions, comments or suggestions, please leave them below, or you can also pop over to the Innsmouth Book Club Facebook page and leave us a message there as well. Do remember to check out the Innsmouth Book Club podcast. Every fortnight we take you on a tour of Innsmouth and talk about weird fiction, movies, music, role-playing games, computer games, and we interview various Lovecraftian types. We'll see you next time.